This is Jonah, chapter 1, Hebrew exegesis of verses 7 through 11, or really an exegesis in both languages and bring you some background on the passage. I apologize, I actually recorded this 2 times and realized that the microphone wasn't on. And so I was able to remedy that after a little troubleshooting. Apologize for being too colloquial in this, but hopefully you will have the benefit of me running through this a few times and maybe it'll go a little smoother, both in my observations and in my pronunciations. Anyway, as we are taking a look at the scripture, verse 7 begins with the phrase, and we'll read it in English, or the clause, and they said to one another. And what we see here in the Hebrew is we have that wa or vav consecutive again, which is formed by the wa or the vav, depending how you want to understand it in Hebrew, basic biblical Hebrew, or in modern Hebrew. But it's the wa or the vav with this vowel pointing underneath it. And the translators here have chosen to translate that as and. Traditionally, as I think I've mentioned in other videos, it's then or therefore is the preferred translation. There's some merit or some reason to do so, that we are bringing forth continued information to use the word and, but I would think then kind of captures that a little better, because what has previously happened, the captain admonishes Jonah, and then we go on to the next scene where we have this joint discussion with all the crew, it looks like, or all the sailors on the ship. And so I would point that out. I would say this is more of a transition here than just a pure continuation, but that's not a major point, but something you may want to consider. And then the phraseology here is that they are saying, each man or a man is saying, El unto Rehu, unto his friend, or unto a comrade, fellow sailor. It's in the construct form, so it belongs to the man's friend, or the man's acquaintance here. The ESV smoothed it out with another. This isn't really the word that would necessarily mean another. And I think it's important, or helpful at least, to point out that it is a discussion amongst the sailors, because what are they doing? They're having sort of this ad hoc council to decide what step they should take. And so you may want to bring that out. Yes, it's clear enough in the English, or at least the ESV, but they're really talking to each sailor, to each other, in order to how they should proceed. And what they do next is they say "come" in laku in the English, which is the form of halak in this particular passage, and it is in the imperatival form. Well, it's not an imperative in the sense that it's a command, even though this is how the way the outline breaks it down. It's not so much a command as it is an exhortation or even a plea for urgency, because they're all talking together. Nobody's really in charge. I don't think it's the captain here saying, "Come, let's do this." I mean, it's even in the plural here, us. It's the plural that's being used here. So the point of all that is that it's really emphasizing urgency rather than direction or orders, right? It's the urgency of the situation. Hey, we're in this situation. Come, let's cast these lots and try to figure out what's going on. That's what's being conveyed there. So you might want to bring that out. And then you do have the wa correlative or the wa conjunctive here. So you see the difference in the pointing. This here is the schwa, the 2 dots underneath. And that is indicating that usually would use the word and. However, the reason I don't think they're bringing in the word and in here is maybe that's redundant, but also the word nefal, which is the cast or casting, is in the cordative form. And what that means is essentially a first-person statement of something we should do, an admonition, exhortation. It's not quite an imperative. That would be in the second-person form. This is in the first-person form. We're saying we as a corporate group, let's do this. So it's emphasizing that urgency once again, that we should together cast lots, and it's translated perfectly in the ESV. Let is the helping word you would use in English to convey that. So let us cast lots. We're doing this urgently. And then you have this word here, goral. It looks kind of like gadol, but note this, there's a resh, not daleth. So if you're just looking at the Hebrew, be careful. It's not another example of the key word gadol. It's a different word. It's the word for lot. Not much to say about it linguistically, but I would encourage you to dig into it a little bit historically. They can give your people a little understanding of what's going on here. Recall the lots aren't necessarily pagan or gambling or something like that. God does control the lots. You can take a look at some of the verses to that point. And in this case, he certainly does, as we'll see. He is in control of where the lots fall. And you can bring in some background about what the lots look like. Traditionally, my understanding, obviously I'm not an expert on Near East history and archaeology and the like, but that there were little stones that they had markings on, and then they would cast those, and it would be used to determine different things. And in some cases, God did use it. It was an appropriate method of understanding a divine decree. Obviously, we don't do that today, but at least then, and even in the New Testament, how they determined who the apostle that would replace Judas would be was the casting of lots. So something like that. One commentator noted that it's probably they were using pot shards and putting markers on there rather than stones being on the ship. That might make sense. Once again, that's something you can dig in a little bit more, but it would probably be good to give a little bit of historical background there as you explain the passage. And then here, if you look at the phrase, we may know on whose account this evil has come upon us at the end, there is some debate, and the reason I bring this up, let's stay in the English just because it's a little easier to work with than the Hebrew in this case, that that phrase could refer to the source rather than the object, and I don't think the grammar necessarily tells us. It's more context, as often is the case with Hebrew. But some will say that's the source, so they're more concerned about which God is responsible, and as we find out, it's Yahweh. But which God? That's what they really want to get at, and that may be true to some sense. But I think their perspective here is it's more about the person, the object of the wrath, which is Jonah. And so if you see commentators like that, I don't think they're right if they're saying it's more about they want to know who the God is, though that's secondary. That is a concern. But look, the same phrase is used. We'll stay with English. We may know on whose account this evil has come upon us. Well, what does it say down here? On whose account this evil has come upon us when they're interrogating Jonah. And then what follows, they pepper him with all these inquiries, all these questions, and it all goes back to who Jonah is. So I think that's a strong support that the basis here, it is the object of the wrath, who's brought this evil upon the ship, not who's the one who is the source of the calamity they're in. I don't think that's the focus here. You can dig in that more, but that's my opinion on that. Like I said, I think it's a little easier just to work in the English, but certainly delve into the Hebrew if you feel that's helpful. Another thing that we will look at the Hebrew on is look at this word evil that the ESV has translated. Not sure what your translation says, but the underlying word is hara, which is the Hebrew word for evil. We have the definite article, so the evil here. It'd just be ra is the word for evil. And as you might see, if you look at the bubble at the bottom, if you can see that, but the gloss that Logos gives me, at least in this particular Hebrew Bible text, is disaster, is the disaster. And they've translated here as evil. Well, both are correct. This is the more literal translation. And I think there's a benefit in keeping it more literal because there's sort of a play on words. You've seen this word before in the passage with the evil that came up in verse 2 onto God, as Nineveh's evil. Well, now evil is coming onto the ship, but let's be careful not push that too hard. And maybe a play on words there. But the evil really is it's a natural, or maybe we could call it natural disaster. It's a divine disaster, but it's a calamity. It's a situation. It's a disaster. It's a calamity, something like that. And so I don't think we would push too hard to say, well, it's Jonah's evil that's come upon them. That's what they're trying to figure out. No, they're trying to figure out why are they in this situation. And so it's really more getting the sense of the effects of what they're experiencing rather than the reason, rather than the evil. So just be careful with that. As you work through it, of course, you can delve into all this more, but that would be my understanding. I think that makes more sense. It's not moral evil that's being dealt with. It's natural destruction that's being dealt with in that passage. So as they proceed on, they do cast lots. And what we see here is that the lot fell on Jonah. So let's look again at the Hebrew. I think there's some insight we can have here. So the word for falling is nephal. And we'll notice kind of how this is phrased. It almost looks passive, right? That the lot fell on Jonah. And it's not because the verb here is a verb that's indicating passivity or the passive voice. It's in the call stem, and that is the really basic Hebrew stem that really is just a simple action. It's not indicating anything like being passive as some other stems would. So there's nothing special about the Hebrew that causes it to be translated that way. It's really just following the word order of the Hebrew, and that is the subject comes after the verb. And what's the subject? It is the lot. The lot, or the goral, is the subject here, and it's following all Jonah onto Jonah. So good translation here, but there's something embedded in that, and that is lots don't fall by themselves, right? I mean, I guess somebody's tossing the lot, so in some ways you could see that, but I think the emphasis here is that something is the subject is the lot, and the lot is falling. Well, what's causing the lot to fall, or at least fall in the way it does? It's heavily implied that it's God, that God's divine intervention is there. And so I think there's a lot of expositional and application and pastoral points you can draw from that, namely God's sovereignty. So God's in control of all this. He is in control of the weather. He's in control of everything that's taking place in this scenario, including the lot falling on Jonah. He's in control of the lot. And in particular, he's allowing Jonah's sin to be exposed here. So it's falling upon Jonah. Jonah's sin has been exposed in the situation, and there's a pastoral or an applicative point in that if we act like Jonah and try to conceal our sins, as Jonah was doing up until the end, God has the ability and oftentimes will reveal those sins. So it's better to deal with that initially, as Jonah had the opportunity to do, rather than let the lot fall on you. So grammatical point, I think, turns into a pastoral and an application point. Let's continue on to verse 8 here. So we have verse 8. And verse 8 tells us that they are now speaking to Jonah. So the men speak to Jonah. And once again, we see this idea of the tell us this account. So this refers to Jonah because of the questions that follow. And you have this word evil again. We already dealt with that. But what's most interesting, I think, in this passage is you have these verbless clauses that begin with questions. So you have ma, which is the interrogative, what in Hebrew. And then you have mean, which is the interrogative for where. And then this doesn't really have that interrogative term, but it's kind of, and of what people are you? That's sort of where you're from, in a sense, at least which clan you're from, which kin you're from. So it's what and where essentially is being asked. And it's being asked in this rapid fire series of questions. So that the propositional outline I have that Logos provides is doing a good job breaking that down. But I think the fact that there's no verbs here, which isn't unusual for Hebrew, but I think there's a point there that these quick verbless clauses are indicating that these are coming very quickly at Jonah, maybe from multiple sailors, and he's just not able to even keep up with them. Maybe there's more things that weren't asked about, but you can dig into the reason for each of these questions. The first one's probably dealing with has Jonah done something in his profession, whether being a prophet or even somebody who didn't commit his vows to his deity. Is that causing this problem? And then the other things are really just driving at who's your God? Where'd you come from? Geographically, what's your country? What's your nationality? What's your ethnicity? What people are you from? And that would indicate what God has been offended in this situation. So it does come back in some ways on whose account to the source, but the real focus is initially at least Jonah, and then from that they're trying to derive who Jonah has offended. Well, there might be some more in verse 8, but I think it'd be wise to move on to verse 9 and look at some details there, because this is a verse that's really packed with quite a bit here. I would say the center, if you're preaching, obviously you can break the passage down how you want. I might not be doing it with the best, based upon the best parameters, but it's kind of just what's manageable for me preaching the sermons. I would say the center of this passage would be that the lots fell on Jonah, that Jonah's exposed. That's the big deal, the big idea, I think, of the passage. But there's a lot of information being gleaned in verse 9, being conveyed to us, and that there, I think there's a lot that it helps us understand Jonah, and a lot of application in it. So he's saying, I'm a Hebrew, right? We don't necessarily have to look at the Hebrew text itself, ironically, but he's saying, I'm a Hebrew, and what I do, I fear the Lord. Now, this does require us to look a little bit at the Hebrew text, and let me just bring that into lines. Excuse me for a second. So we have it on top. So this is verse 9. They're speaking to Jonah. He says he's a Hebrew. And I apologize. When I says I am a Hebrew, in Hebrew, what is this word of re? Well, that is Hebrew. He is a Hebrew. And you can dig a little bit more. I'm not going to go into it in some of the background of that word. That can be helpful. But look at the order. I mean, the pronoun that I comes second. What's being moved to the front? As a Hebrew. And I think that's emphatic that he's very proud of his Hebrew or his Jewish or Israeli background or Israelite background, pardon me. And because of that, he's emphasizing his Hebrew roots. And then he says that he fears the Lord. And well, what is the word in small caps in most translations, most English translations? Lord, it is this word Yahweh. It's a divine name. So when he's saying this, as the sailors hear it, he's not saying I fear the Lord. He's saying I fear Yahweh, and that's important because these are Phoenicians. Remember, they know who Yahweh is. They're the civilization next door. They've probably heard about his defeat of Baal. They certainly would probably know about him being the god of the Exodus. This is a powerful God, even if they don't worship him rightly or worship him at all. They know the Hebrew God is a powerful God. So verse 9 is really almost the worst news these guys could get. Yeah, I'm a Hebrew and I've offended Yahweh is essentially what he's saying, and that leads to their reaction in verse 10. He also adds the additional, almost parenthetical, it's a merism in Hebrew that essentially it's an extensive statement. He's the God of heaven, and then he's all the way from heaven, in control of heaven, all the way down to the dry land and then the bottom of the sea. So he controls and created everything that's ever existed. So now the irony here, the reason I would point this out for us, is that he's very proud of being a Hebrew who worship Yahweh. He claims to fear or maybe even worship or revere Yahweh. And then he emphasizes there's a sound theological statement that this is the God of heaven who's made absolutely everything. So that's all very correct information. However, does anything in Jonah's life in this book really indicate, at least in this book itself, indicate that he's a faithful Hebrew that who truly reveres or worships Yahweh? And that while he can say these great theological statements, that he absolutely absorbs these things. And what is he doing? He's running away from him. So he may be a Hebrew who's very proud of being a Hebrew, and particularly in the contrast to those lowly Gentiles, particularly the ones in Nineveh, and even the sailors he's working with, or he's on their ship. But nothing indicating that he's really faithful in that designation. He might claim to fear the Lord, fear Yahweh, but doesn't seem like there's anything he's doing that's indicating that he's revering the Lord, let alone even fear in the most natural base sense. He's trying to escape him. And then how's he trying to escape Yahweh? Well, he is trying to do so over the sea that he admits Yahweh created. So the very Yahweh's own creation that he owns and controls, that's the avenue over which he's trying to escape God himself. Doesn't make a lot of sense there. So he's really being very inconsistent. You could use the word hypocritical if you want. You could use the any other number of words to describe just how inconsistent all these statements are, though, with Jonah's actions. And so I think there's a strong application there too. I mean, it's very easy. I don't want to delve too much into preaching or making any sort of controversial application, but we can be proud, right, in being a Christian. People who say, I'm a Christian. I'm a God-fearing man, and I can even make very sound, very orthodox theological statements. But does our life reflect that? I mean, is there really any value to being that would people see us really as a Christian that makes us different than anybody else? Do we really act like we fear or revere God, even if we say we do? Are we really God-fearing as a slogan, or is that something real in our lives? And then, well, perfectly wonderful orthodox statements we can come up with from any number of sources, including direct biblical quoting from Scripture. But once again, do we really believe that? Do our lives reflect that? So something I think that's a good pastoral admonition, even for us. Just all these things are, of course, for us as well. But in particular, is that us? I mean, am I a pastor or a preacher in the Word of God? Okay, well, how does my life reflect it? How does my trust in the Lord reflect that? And even as I work through and pray through this, and even as I speak it now, I feel conviction over that. And so I trust your people would benefit from that explanation as well. Well, then we are told in verse 10, so we do see in verse 10 the wall consecutive finally. I'm just teasing about the ESV a little bit, but they are consistent with what I learned, at least, that this should be then. So then the men were exceedingly afraid, which is good. Literally, what this means is then the men feared. The men were afraid, I guess is a fair translation, but literally I think it's then the men here feared a fear, this is the noun for fear, great, or the men feared a great fear. Now the ESV smoothed that out and say they were exceedingly afraid. That's capturing the sense, absolutely. It's just that you have the word Gadola here, or Gadol, and that's a kind of a key word of the great wind, the great storm, the great city. Now you have the great fear that's come on them, and once again, well, a great God has been offended by Jonah's great sin. So you can emphasize that again. It's not as clear in the English, but you do have that key word again in the Hebrew. And you have this statement here, and I call it a statement because what is it that you have done? And there's an exclamation point. What you find here in the ma zot sita and phrase here, and that's the interrogative ma, which is what, and then this is the demonstrative pronoun. What's this? And then this is done or make, do or make. So what is this that you have done or made? And it's a question, right? The word ma is an interrogative. It's a question word. But ESV translators, I think, rightly add an exclamation point because this isn't a genuine request for information, right? It's essentially if you say, how could you do this or something like that, you're not really asking how they could do it. You're essentially rebuking them. You're upset. You're not expecting an explanation, or at least you're not asking a genuine question there. And that's the same thing here. And then why did they act this way? Why are they so afraid? Well, we saw that a little bit and why they respond this, but specifically, it's the men knew he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord, and why do they know that? Because he had told them. Well, did you see that above in any of the statements Jonah made? No. So we're told later on, parenthetically almost, that Jonah somewhere in that dialogue, we don't have the whole dialogue, of course, apparently, because he told them he was fleeing from the presence of the Lord. Not much to look in the Hebrew about that, but consider verses 1 through 3 is pretty much the description of Jonah fleeing from the Lord. So it may have been that he gave them either exactly what we see in Jonah 1 through 3 or an amplified version of that. You remember how foolish we thought Jonah was, and he clearly is, even if we see that in our own lives as well, fleeing the word of the Lord. Well, they see the foolishness of that, and they're also living through that foolishness. I mean, they're not having a conversation in a coffee shop here, right? They're having a conversation while this boat's being rocked around the sea and threatening to be destroyed. And so, essentially, how could you do this? That you would flee the presence of the Lord, and now we're living with the repercussion of that. So you can tease that out a little bit more, but I think that's a good point to bring out. And then finally, verse 11. It kind of goes with the next verse and also with this verse. I'm ending at verse 11 in my sermon. I'll probably bring it back in the next time I preach again with some reminders there. There's not a lot in here, but I would say there's one exegetical point is that some commentaries will move the quotation marks down to the end. Not all Bible translations have quotation marks, and there's some good reason for that beyond maybe that just wasn't convention previously, but a good reason for that is that when you make that decision to put quotation marks in, you're kind of adding an interpretation because you're saying this is the statement. Some, like I said, would add for the sea grew more and more tempestuous as an explanation they give. Now, I don't think that's correct. I mean, this is probably the narrator's interjection, just as up here was that this you've done, and that was clearly here the narrator adding some information afterwards, beginning with the word key or for, translated for in English, the word key. And then down here in verse 11, you have the key. Again, I think it's just the narrator's explanation. So I think the ESV got it right with the quotation marks there, but you may run into that. Anyway, I think that's, I want to keep it close to 20 minutes as I can. And we had a few more verses, but some good things to pick out, more things that you could look at. I pray that this will help you as you begin and work through your research and gives you some structure to start off of as you build your sermon or Bible study or lesson. Or if you're just digging into the scripture more, I pray that this helps you get a better understanding for what this important and encouraging and convicting book has for us. And look forward to seeing you in the next video. God bless. Bye.